first night frost came early that year. September hadn't yet gone stale in the trees, hadn't turned the cottonwoods gold, but the dirt up on Briar Ridge had already gone hard under boots. And under that first frost, while the town drank and played cards, Nora Byrne crouched beneath her half-finished floorboards with clay on her elbows, soot on her cheeks, and something red and burning behind her eyes that had nothing to do with her fire. She had one hand braced against the foundation rock, the other steadying the narrow brick arch of the underground flue, and she did not look up, not even when the wind blew pine needles down her back, or when her baby coughed again from the bundle she'd tucked in the corner. There was no time for distraction, not with winter coming, not after what she'd already lost. 2 months earlier, and Nora had been the butcher's wife. She had worn clean aprons and walked with a hand against her swollen belly. She had answered the door to neighbors, cooked supper for her husband's brother, and stacked salt pork in the back room like a woman who believed next winter would come and go like the last. Hard, yes, but survivable. That belief died the night a broken beam dropped across the roof of their apartment, and her husband never came out. And after the fire, after the funeral, after her brother-in-law told her flat that she'd better go back east, Nora, she'd wrapped her baby in canvas, strapped a pick to her shoulder, and walked 7 miles out of town until the path disappeared. She didn't stop walking until she found the bluff where no men would follow. Then she began to dig. The ridge was dry but not lifeless. Juniper and spruce pushed up against bare rock, and the ground sloped in a way that meant sun in the morning and shelter from northern wind. The women in town called her mad, said a widow with a newborn had no business scratching at the hillside like a badger. They'd ride past sometimes, 2 or 3 at a time, shaking their heads and not offering help. The men were crueler. They'd sit on their horses and point at the pile of stone and dirt she was dragging up, asking if she was building a chimney to hell. She never answered. They hadn't understood the design, not when she'd drawn it in the dirt with a stick, and not when she'd begun laying it in clay and sweat. Her cabin would not sit on the ground like theirs. It would not take its warmth from above and lose it to the snow. No, the heat in hers would rise from beneath, carried by a flue that stretched from an exterior fire pit down low on the slope, tunneled under the floor, then exited on the far side with a stone chimney that didn't rise vertical, but lay flat. A buried stovepipe? They'd scoffed. Underground heat? One man laughed until he spit. But Nora kept laying the bricks, one tight arch at a time, packing clay into every gap and checking again and again that the grade stayed just right. It had to. The smoke had to pull. The heat had to rise, or her baby would die before New Year. She worked through the rain, dug through hail. The bluff shielded her from the worst winds, but nothing could block the way she was spoken to in town when she returned once a week for supplies. "Stovepipes on the outside?" the hardware man asked, making no attempt to hide the grin. "You know fire don't like lying down, right?" She didn't explain. She just asked for the fittings and left. The chimney was already 2/3 complete, but the work took everything. Her fingers bled raw. Her knuckles stayed red and swelled. The baby cried more often now, waking from dreams with hiccuped breath. She gave him what milk she could, but the stress soured it. On the 3rd week, when the underground flue was ready to be sealed, she had to barter the last silver wedding band she owned for nails and a sheet of iron to make a clean stoveplate where the fire would begin. She lit the first fire October 3rd, just a test. One small branch set burning in the hollow pit at the flue's mouth. She sat back on her haunches and waited. Nothing at first. The flame flickered, tried to rise, but the slope pulled the draft, and soon the smoke curled forward into the tunnel. She covered the opening and went inside. Then she pressed her palm to the clay-packed dirt above the flue, still raw and earthen beneath her cabin's unfinished floor. It was warm. She wept. By November, the snow had fallen once already, melted, then returned heavier. The valley cabins lost their warmth in the night and stayed cold by morning. Nora's stayed warm, not hot, not yet. The fire she built each dawn was careful, small at first. The underground flue, warmed slowly, began to radiate. The heat touched the rocks, and the rocks held it. There were no gaps for wind. The fireplace sat outside, so no smoke ever entered the room where she and her son slept. It wasn't magic. It was just old ideas brought to life. Techniques some called Russian, others Chinese, others Roman, but none used by the frontier men here who only knew how to stack logs and vent upward. They didn't know what to make of her. That first hard freeze, one neighbor rode out to mock her again, said his cabin had turned to ice, and he figured she'd be begging to sleep in someone's barn by week's end. He peered into the shadows of her doorway, into the stone-framed home low to the earth, and hugged by a wall of piled dirt at its back. Then he laughed. "What's that I smell?" he asked. You burning your bed? She didn't answer. She only stepped back and shut the door. She had lined the inside with rock, not wood. The chimney flue, flat, thick and warm beneath her floor, ran the length of the cabin like a buried vein. She hadn't laid floorboards yet because she wanted to test how well the flue heated bare ground. And what she'd found was astonishing. The stones closest to the flue remained warm for hours after the fire died. So she began shaping the room around that, built the bed near the flue's widest stretch, positioned the cradle where the floor stayed warmest. Her baby stopped coughing. His lips no longer turned pale at dawn. Some mornings she woke to find her breath no longer formed mist in the air. But the men in town didn't want to believe. They spread stories instead, said her cabin was too low, too strange, too damp, said no woman could survive a real winter without a proper chimney. One neighbor claimed she'd stolen the design from a Chinaman. Another said he'd seen smoke coming from her foundation, and that was proof she didn't know what she was doing. The truth, that was harder to spread. Truth had no voice when men wanted to feel superior. The snow deepened, the river froze. 2 cabins collapsed in the valley when the weight of the storm pushed too hard on the roofs. Nora's stayed dry. The outer fire pit had a wide capstone. She could slide over it during snow. The flue remained unblocked. The chimney exit, low and built into a false stump of rock on the far end of her cabin, never iced over because the rising heat kept it just warm enough. One night in December, a child from a neighboring cabin was found near frostbitten. His mother had fallen sick, the chimney in their place had cracked, and the wind had blown straight through. They knocked on 3 doors before someone finally brought them inside. Nora only heard about it days later when she went to trade for oats. You must be frozen near to death up in that dirt hole, the woman behind the counter said with a laugh. Half of town is breaking up their chairs for firewood. Nora didn't answer, but when she opened her bundle to pay, steam rose off the cloth. The inside of her pack had stayed warm the whole way down the ridge. Someone saw it. They watched her a little differently after that. By January, the town had begun to whisper again, but less with scorn now, and more with that hungry, uncertain edge that follows survival. 3 more families had fled the valley cabins for relatives in the city. One man was found dead in his chair. Another lost a hand trying to chop wood in the freeze. But still Nora's cabin held. Still her floor radiated warmth each night, without smoke, without wind, without open flame. Just the low, radiant heat of buried stone pulled through the ground by a fire outside. And then came the week of the blizzard. The wind began on a Tuesday night and did not stop for 3 days. Snow fell sideways. Ice scoured every wall. The town's main store lost its front window. A roof collapsed on a saloon. At one point, a fire began in a chimney and nearly took out a boarding house, but the cold froze the blaze before it could spread. No one dared go outside. The roads vanished beneath drifts. Children huddled against their mothers. Men cursed the wind and blamed the trees. But high on Briar Ridge, Nora lit her fire each morning, placed a pot of broth near the flue mouth, then held her baby in her lap and pressed her bare feet against the warmest stretch of the stone-packed floor. Her cabin was not cold, it was warm. The morning after the blizzard stopped, the snow was so deep in the valley that men had to dig out sideways through their front doors. Livestock froze where they stood, some upright, their hooves encased in ice. Trees cracked under the weight. One man lost the tip of his nose to frostbite walking 100 yards. No wagon could roll, no rider could pass. The wind had died, but the cold stayed, deep, dry, and absolute. That same morning, Nora Byrne opened the door to her cabin and stepped barefoot onto packed earth. The sun was pale and distant. A cold coin hung above a world rimmed in silence, and yet steam still curled gently from the stone ring that marked the end of her underground flue. The fire pit near the slope's edge, buried half in snow, still held enough ember for her to rekindle the morning heat. Inside, her baby stirred with a quiet sound, not the gasping cries she'd once feared on colder mornings. His breath was soft, his cheeks flushed, not from fever but from warmth. The cradle sat above the longest stretch of the buried chimney arch. She'd spent weeks arranging the rocks just so, shaping the floor like a shallow bowl, the warmest heart of it at the center. She used her hands to brush off snow from the fire pit cap, opened the intake cover, and built the flame slowly. First tinder, then coals, then small wood, feeding heat into the hollow chamber that ran under her entire cabin. And again, like every morning before, the fire pulled forward, not upward, not into the sky, but through the clay-packed tunnel under her home, into the low chimney stack built like a stone log across the far edge of her shelter. The heat stayed. By midday, Others began the hard work of digging paths. One man tried to reach his neighbor's place and fell waist-deep with every step. The town's blacksmith, a heavy-set man who prided himself on never needing help, broke 3 axes trying to cut firewood in the freeze. Word began to move between households, not in letters or announcements, but in whispers passed between snow-buried porches. "You hear about the widow? Which one? The one up the ridge. Nora? Oh, her. Thought she was dead. No, she's still warm. She's what? They say her place never dropped below freezing. That's not possible. Well, the smoke don't go up. You mean she ain't got a chimney? She's got one. Just runs sideways. You serious? I didn't say I believed it. I said I heard it. By the end of the week, 3 cabins had lost all usable firewood. A young mother in town had resorted to burning her front door. Another family burned their table. Some begged at neighbors' doors, but most everyone was too near empty themselves. And that's when someone finally made the climb. 2 men, both trappers who'd known her husband before the fire, took a pair of snowshoes and struck out toward the ridge. It was dangerous. The snow hadn't settled yet, still light enough to collapse inward in places, deep enough to swallow a man whole. But they walked anyway, each dragging a sled with food, hoping maybe she'd gone mad and needed rescuing, or else she'd starved and they could bring back her body. But what they found, they said afterward, it looked like a dream. The chimney near the bluff's edge was hot to the touch, red stones glowing faint through packed snow. No smoke curled upward. It drifted flat, hugging the air, trailing from the false stump where she'd built the outflow like a vent. When they knocked on her door, she opened it slowly. One of them said she didn't look scared, just tired, like someone who had worked too long and still hadn't finished the job. They offered her salt pork and dried apples. She accepted. They asked how she kept warm. She didn't answer, but she stepped aside and let them in. Inside, they saw the truth for themselves. The floor gave off heat, not hot, but steady, a kind of lingering warmth that settled in the bones. The baby was asleep. Her hands were bare. The air smelled of clay and broth and firewood, but no smoke, no ash, no soot, just radiant heat like stone warmed by sun. They said nothing at first. Then one of them knelt near the bed and touched the ground. "It's hot," he muttered. "Not hot," she corrected. "It holds." When they left, they took more than food. They took stories. And the next day, when they returned to town, they brought those stories with them. The reaction was not what they expected. Some refused to believe, said it was trickery, or luck, or lies. Others got angry, claimed she'd used some outlaw trick, or that she'd gotten help from the Chinamen in the mines. A few men took offense at the idea that a woman had outsmarted them in their own country, with their own tools. But others, especially those with crying children and no dry wood, looked to the ridge with new eyes, and soon the questions began. How'd she build it? What kind of fire pulls down? What kind of chimney runs under? Did she dig a tunnel? What's it made of? Brick? Stone? None had answers. And the ones who did, those 2 trappers, were careful, protective, maybe even a little ashamed that they hadn't thought of it first. But the ice didn't wait. More storms came. More wood ran out. The general store was shuttered for 3 days straight. A widow on the edge of town lost both her goats to exposure. Then one morning, Nora awoke to find boot tracks in the snow, fresh near her chimney. Someone had been close, watching. She didn't panic. She simply added more stones near the flue's intake, stacked them like a crude barrier, and scattered the snow to hide the prints. Then she lit her fire again and stayed inside. That night, there was a knock. Soft, measured. She waited. Another knock. She opened the door slow, hand near the iron wedge she used to stoke the fire. A woman stood there, young, maybe 19, holding something bundled in a shawl. "I heard what you built," she said quietly. Nora said nothing. "My boy's sick," the girl whispered. We ain't got no heat. And the roof's—" Nora stepped back and let her in. That was the first. 2 days later, a man came, hat in hand, frostbite on 2 fingers, his face grey from cold. He didn't speak, just looked at her with eyes hollowed by hunger and wind. She let him in too. Before the week ended, 5 more followed. Some came with nothing. Some brought wood, food, whatever they could carry. She didn't ask. She didn't bargain. She just made space. Cleared floor near the flue, showed them where to sleep. They all said the same thing when they stepped inside. "It's warm, not hot, not smoky. Not scorched like the cabins where wood stoves overheated the air, then dropped it to bitter chill the moment flames died. No, hers held, constant, quiet, steady, and in that warmth, people changed. The young mother nursed her baby again without him crying. The old man with frostbite wept softly the second night and didn't explain why. One boy said it reminded him of summer, not the sun, but the way the stones felt in the shade. One night, while she sat by the cradle, the girl with the newborn finally asked, "Where'd you learn it?" Nora stared into the embers. "My father," she said quietly, "used to build smoke trenches on the mountainside. Said the heat only ever rises if you let it. Said you could pull it too, guide it." The girl nodded slowly. "They all said you were crazy? I probably am, but you're warm." That night, she dreamed of her husband for the first time since the fire. Not the night he died, but the first week they'd come west, hands calloused, hearts hungry, both of them standing in the snow with no roof, but smiling anyway. She woke with tears already dry on her cheeks. By February, the thaw hadn't come. Ice held the trees like iron. The river was solid glass. But every day more eyes turned toward the ridge, and more hearts grew desperate. The final test came the night a family of 5 arrived. 2 children, blue-lipped, the mother shaking. The father collapsed in the snow before he reached the door. Nora brought them in, laid the children near the warmest point, fed them broth from a stone pot that had never once cooled since November. The flue's radiant warmth saved them. When the father woke 2 days later, he wept into her shoulder. "You saved us," he whispered. "No," she said. "The fire did." But by then, the town knew, and the laughing had stopped. By March, the whole town had heard the stories, but the laughter had changed. It wasn't the loud, mocking kind anymore, the barroom chuckles or the porch front snickers that had followed Nora Byrne through town in the early days. It was quieter now, uneasy, the kind of laughter that filled silence when a man didn't want to admit he'd been wrong, didn't want to say out loud that he hadn't thought a woman could outbuild him, outlast him, outwarm him. But they all knew now. They knew. Some had walked to her cabin during the worst nights, just to make sure the stories were true. Some had come because their own children's teeth wouldn't stop chattering. Others came with eyes lowered, holding out bundles of dried meat, sacks of potatoes or baskets of firewood, not asking to come in, just hoping she'd notice the offering. Nora didn't speak much anymore. She didn't need to. Her fire spoke for her. Her home had become something more than a shelter now. It had become proof that warmth didn't always come from height or size or the thickest log. Proof that sometimes the oldest ways, the strangest ideas, the things that sounded foolish, worked. And that maybe, just maybe, they worked because the person who built them never stopped working. Not when it snowed, not when it rained, not when the whole world said she was wrong. And still, every day, she lit her fire. The flue was stronger now. The first few layers had dried and hardened over winter. The packed clay had baked beneath weeks of heat, forming a crust that held warmth even longer. The central chamber of her floor stayed warm, long into the night. Some mornings she didn't need to stoke the fire until noon. The stones held the heat on their own. It was the buried chimney that made it all possible, and now everyone wanted one. But that was where the trouble started. Not all men took kindly to asking a widow for help. Some gritted their teeth and muttered around it, dropping hints about curious builders or creative solutions. Others tried to copy what little they thought they knew, digging short trenches in the snow, laying down tin stovepipe, burning huge fires and choking themselves in smoke when the drafts failed to pull. A few came to her cabin and asked outright, "Ma'am, could you explain how it works? Miss Byrne, if I brought you stone, would you draw it out for me?" She never said no. But she didn't say yes either. Instead, she'd look at the ground, her baby in her arms, and say, "It's not just the flue, it's everything." And that was the truth. Because it wasn't just a pipe, it was slope, it was grade, it was draft and sealing and material, and the patience to pack clay into every seam with bare fingers until your skin peeled. It was calculating how long the heat would take to reach the far wall. It was watching the smoke's breath curl sideways and learning how the fire pulled, not how it pushed. It was 1,000 hours of grief and dirt and fire, and you couldn't draw that on paper, but still they tried. A man named Clem Holbrook, who once told Nora to get back east where the women belong, tried to lay a buried flue under his chicken shed using tar and bricks he'd stolen from the collapsed church. He didn't build the intake right, didn't understand the slope. Smoke poured into the henhouse. The birds died in a day. His face turned black from soot, and even after that he still said, "Well, it's a bad idea anyway. Smoke's meant to rise." Others blamed the wind or the snow or the firewood itself, anything but the fact that the idea hadn't come from them. Only one person built it right. Her name was Eliza Callan. She was 32, widow, 3 children, lived just past the river's bend, in a low-set dugout that barely passed for a home. She didn't speak much in town, never came to socials, never begged for firewood, but she'd heard what Nora built, and instead of mocking it or begging for drawings, she watched. One morning in early March, She walked the ridge with her youngest wrapped to her chest and 2 baskets strapped to her back, one of stone, the other of questions. Nora didn't ask her to leave. She just motioned toward the bench and handed her a mug of broth. Eliza sat in silence for a while, then finally said, "Yours pulls clean." Nora nodded. "You dug the trench first?" "Before I ever laid a wall," Eliza thought. "Soot ever back up?" "Only once, early on. I added a stone lip." "The draw. How long's the run?" Nora motioned to the floor. "Starts 20 feet that way, ends at the stone vent." Eliza looked down, tapped her boot against the warmest patch of dirt. "You shaped the arch?" "By hand. Clay, straw, ash, packed every inch." The 2 women sat for an hour, maybe more, and when Eliza left, she didn't leave empty. She built her flue in silence. Starting at the edge of her dugout, working down the slope, borrowing stone from the edge of the dry creek where no one dared plant. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing, didn't brag or explain or ask for help. And in April, when the thaw began and the last great freeze swept in one last time, her children slept through the night without coughing. By May, there were 5 more, 5 homes in the valley where smoke didn't rise anymore, but pulled flat, silent, warm through the earth. And still, none of the men had managed to make it work. One tried burying a stove. The draft failed. Another dug too shallow. The snow collapsed the trench. A third tried laying metal flue under bare dirt, only to find that frost buckled the pipe and cracked the joints. But the women who listened, not to how it looked, but to why it worked, built warmth into the earth itself. And slowly the laughter died. It didn't happen all at once. It came in looks first, in silence, in the way men stopped speaking when Nora passed them on the road, in the way they stood straighter, suddenly unsure of themselves. Then came the letters, from places beyond the valley, from ranches across the plains, from widows who'd heard tales passed mouth to mouth down the trade roads, letters written in awkward hands asking if it was true, asking if a woman really had built a chimney underground, asking if it could be done again. Nora read them by firelight, never answering. She wasn't looking to teach. She wasn't looking to preach. She'd built her home to survive, and she had, but something had shifted, not just in the way heat traveled through earth, but in how ideas traveled through silence. The men still spoke in their circles, claiming it wasn't practical, claimed it only worked on ridges, claimed it wasn't a real chimney. But the women were no longer listening to them. They were listening to each other. And Nora, without ever trying to lead, had shown them something more than warmth. She had shown them what happened when the world told a woman she couldn't, and she did anyway. And by the time the thaw came fully, when the river cracked and ran again, when the mud returned to the road and the first buds showed on the bluff, the laughter was gone entirely. In its place was a quiet respect no one dared say aloud. But it was there, in the eyes of those who passed her door, in the silence of those who once mocked her, in the warmth that now lived in places where before there had only been cold, and in the ridge above town, smoke still did not rise. It pulled forward, beneath, through earth, the way Nora had always known it could. End of part 3, moving to part 4 next. Part 4, moving to part 5 next. Title: Neighbors laughed when a widow ran a chimney under her cabin. Until it stayed warm, all winter spring came slow that year. The freeze had sunk too deep. It clung to the roots of things, to the timbers of cabins that had dried too quick and cracked under their own silence. Snowmelt didn't rush. It dripped, thick and stubborn, carving narrow channels through earth still clenched in the memory of frost. But it came, and when it did, so did the reckoning. The town had lost 3 families, one to the cold outright. One had left in the night and never returned. Another had simply disappeared between storms, their cabin door left swinging. Livestock herds had thinned by half. Roofs sagged. A dozen chimneys lay toppled where the brick had split from freeze and moisture. Woodpiles rotted in standing slush. And through it all, one cabin on Briar Ridge had remained, not untouched, but unbroken. Nora's. She didn't emerge triumphant. There was no celebration, no speech. She came to town the same way she had all winter, on foot, her child strapped to her chest, her shoulders pulled tight with the kind of tension that doesn't ease just because spring says it can. She didn't smile, didn't strut. She just bought flour and salt and tobacco for an older woman who'd stayed with her 3 weeks during the storm. Then she left, but others saw her, and they talked. They talked about the way her child's skin looked, healthy, pink, not pale or drawn. They talked about how her pack always let off the faintest curl of warmth when she unwrapped it to pay. They talked about how she'd never asked for firewood or help or a man to check on things. And they began to talk less about her chimney and more about her. "She's not just lucky," one woman said on the way to the river. "No," her friend replied. "She's smart, built it like she knew the freeze before it came. She saw it coming. Maybe she just remembered how it felt to be cold. Some folks forget." That was the part no one wanted to admit, that what Nora had built wasn't just clever. It wasn't just survival. It was memory made solid, grief hardened into clay and stone and fire. Her baby had lived because she'd remembered what loss felt like, and had refused to feel it again. Her home had survived because she'd been willing to bury herself halfway to do it, and her chimney had warmed more people than any wood stove in that valley, not because it was magic, but because it worked, and that made it dangerous, to the old ways, to the old pride, to the men who'd built their cabins the way their fathers had, and their fathers before them, and believed it would always be enough. It no longer was. In April, a letter arrived from another town, 3 valleys west, then another from further still. A woman who ran the grange in Stillwater sent word asking Nora to please come speak about her design. Someone else wrote offering payment, real coin, to replicate the earth-flue chimney system in their boarding house. She didn't reply. Nora had no interest in becoming a name. She had no blueprint to sell. Her design was half instinct, half memory, all labor. No one could replicate it unless they were willing to crawl on their stomach through frostbitten dirt, packing clay with numb hands, praying each brick would hold. But that didn't stop others from trying. One morning in late April, a boy named Peter Madsen arrived at her door. Barely 14, mud to his knees, said he'd tried to build one just like hers, and had nearly passed out from smoke, asked if he could see the inside of hers again. She let him in. He stood near the cradle, stared at the floor. "It breathes," he said, awe in his voice. "It's like the heat's alive." "It's patient," Nora said. He stayed for an hour, sketched what he could. Before he left, he asked, "Why didn't anyone ever do this before?" She thought for a long while, then said, "Because they thought comfort had to come from above." It wasn't just him. That spring, others followed. They came without pride now, without mocking. The same men who'd sneered now brought stone, clay, tools. Not all asked to see inside. Some just stood near the chimney stack at the edge of her bluff, watching the way the outflow still steamed, even on warm days. One man tried to build a double flue, a pipe under and another over. It failed. Another dug his trench too flat. Smoke backdrafted and nearly asphyxiated his dog. Yet another tried running it beneath his barn. His livestock stampeded when the floor began to radiate too quickly. They didn't understand the control. Nora's flue didn't just carry heat, it paced it, slow, gentle, measured, like breath. The real change came not with imitation but with the stories. Children told them first. "Miss Barnes' cabin has magic floors. You don't see her fire, but she has one. She built a secret fire under the ground." Mothers began asking more openly. They came in pairs. They brought meals, gifts, cloth diapers, even books for her child. One woman baked her a loaf of bread every Sunday through May, just for keeping my brother alive. Another wept in her doorway and said, "If I'd known this was possible, I might still have my little girl." Nora didn't know what to do with these moments. She wasn't seeking gratitude, but she accepted it when it came in silence. She also began to teach, not with lectures or drawings, but with invitation. She let one woman watch her clean the intake cap, another see how she vented the fire to keep the draft moving. She showed a teenager how to stack the bricks with just enough curve to keep the tunnel arched without collapsing. She handed a boy a lump of clay and showed him how to feel when it was too wet, too dry, just right. And in doing so, she planted something far warmer than heat. She planted knowledge, and that knowledge spread faster than any fire. By the time summer came, 7 homes in the valley had begun digging. Not full flues yet, but experiments. Test tunnels, clay domes, fire pits moved from inside to out. The men still built up, but the women had begun to build down, and the earth began to warm, not just in soil, but in spirit. There was no monument built, no plaque, no ceremony. But people began calling the ridge something different now. Not that crazy widow's bluff, but simply Barnes Rise. They said the air was warmer up there. They said the wind didn't bite so hard. They said maybe that woman had figured out something that the rest of them forgot long ago. And when the fall came, when the leaves turned and the frost returned, no one laughed. They listened. The next winter was worse, not colder, not by degree, but harder, sharper, crueler in the way it arrived. A snap freeze in early October took the valley by surprise. Storms rode in before the leaves had fallen. Cattle were lost in pastures. Fruit froze on trees, and a frost line reached 2 feet into the ground before most homesteads had stocked half their firewood. The men cursed it. The women braced for it. But up on Barnes Rise, the ground had already been prepared. The flue had already been cleared. The chimney stone, low, horizontal, and patient, was waiting. That fall, Nora lit the first fire, a week earlier than the year before. The air outside was sharp enough to crack a nail, but in the cradle where her son now sat upright, clutching a carved wooden horse and humming tunelessly, the warmth remained steady. He was 1.5 years old now, spoke 2 words, stumbled when he walked, slept without coughing. They weren't alone anymore. After spring, a few had asked to stay, not for warmth, not for charity, but to learn, to see. One girl, barely 17, had spent the entire summer clearing a second site on the ridge, farther up where the wind cut crueler, to try a flue of her own. A widow from the valley spent afternoons tracing heat lines along the floor with the back of her hand. Even the trappers returned. Less talk this time, more questions, fewer assumptions. They watched how the tunnel had held, how the stones had cracked, or hadn't, how the slope had carried not only smoke but stories. By December there were now 3 cabins with full earth chimneys in the region. Nora's remained the oldest, the most stable, and the warmest. What no one had understood until now was that the strength of the chimney didn't come from the fire. It came from the design. The principles were so old they'd been forgotten. She'd unearthed them from memory, from half-remembered sketches in her father's shop, from the way some cultures ran flues under clay beds or stone benches, not above them. They called them by different names: Kang, saw hypocaust, smoke trench. She called hers the only way. It pulled heat beneath the body, let it rise slow, let it wrap the room like breath, not like a furnace, violent and quick, but like the way a child warms the crook of a mother's arm. And this winter, everyone wanted it. They stopped pretending they didn't. Men came now too, humbled, or maybe just desperate. One carpenter brought an entire wagon of cured boards in exchange for half a day watching her fire. Another man begged to lie flat on her floor, face to the clay, to feel what his children hadn't felt in months. They sat cross-legged near her hearth and listened while she explained how each curve mattered, how draft didn't just happen, it was shaped, how you couldn't force smoke, you had to invite it, guide it, how the slope of the flue was everything. Some learned, some tried. Some failed, but none laughed. That was gone now. Instead, the valley changed. A woman named Elise built a flue under her barn, not for herself but for her goats, who had nearly frozen the year before. Another widow named Tessa dug her fire channel into the side of a slope so the intake and chimney exit could be sealed with stone caps at night. A teenage boy carved clay bricks with hand-punched vents and stacked them in an interlocking tunnel that stretched the length of his family's cellar. When it warmed, their potatoes didn't rot. They lasted into March, and the designs changed too. Nora's was no longer the only shape. Some made shorter tunnels, some longer. Some curved them like a snake, others stacked them in levels beneath different rooms. A few men, stubborn and proud, tried to improve on it with steel, only to find the metal cracked under temperature shift. The women who built with dirt and ash and patient hands, theirs held. When the storms came in January, they came hard. A whiteout covered the valley for 6 days. Roads disappeared. Wind peeled shingles from the schoolhouse roof. The blacksmith's chimney collapsed in on itself. And one morning, a family of 6 was found huddled together in their root cellar, near dead from cold. Nora took in 2 more that month. Not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't forget what it was like to be cold and alone. She cleared space near the flue's heart, wrapped a blanket around a girl whose lips had turned grey, fed broth to a boy with hollow cheeks, and no words left to speak. Their parents never came. She didn't ask what happened. They stayed the rest of the winter. In town, the taverns stayed shuttered most nights, the general store's windows iced over from the inside. But up on Burns Rise you could see a gentle curl of steam drift sideways from the stone vent, low and steady, never high, never wild, just enough. No smoke escaped into the home. The fire stayed outside, the warmth came from below, and the cold never reached the cradle again. People began calling her home the Earth House, not in jest, with reverence, and slowly, things changed. When the spring thaw came, slower this time, more reluctant, it carried the sound of digging, all around the valley, all along the ridges, clay-streaked hands, stone stacks, children helping with small fingers, packing straw into mud, women shaping new spaces beneath their cabins, a few men working quietly alongside them now, not as teachers but as students. The buried chimney had spread, and with it a new way to survive. No one remembered the men who mocked her now. No one quoted their laughter. No one asked where they'd gone. But they remembered her. They remembered the widow who built her fire in the ground, who kept it out of sight, who let it breathe sideways, who lit it every morning not to boast but to live. And when the first wildflowers bloomed in the cracks of Burns Rise, her son toddled out into the light, pointed at the old stone flue, and said his third word, warm. Nora smiled, not for praise, not for victory, but because she knew, this time, he wouldn't forget, not how warmth felt, but how it was made.